This is Classical Ideas with Greg Soden. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. As I was reading the collected letters of Alan Watts, edited by Joan and Ann Watts, who appeared as a two-part special episode about the life and work of Alan Watts in episodes 32 and 33, a moment in the letters jumped out at me, specifically in a letter from Alan to his parents on page 107, and discussed in further detail by Joan Watts on page 209 of that volume. Alan Watts' first mother-in-law was named Ruth Fuller Sasaki. She was an important and influential figure in Zen Buddhism. On page 107 of the collected letters of Alan Watts, Alan writes to his parents of the detention in Japanese internment camps of Ruth's Zen teacher, whom I later discovered is Sokei-an Sasaki, the founder of the first Zen Institute of America, the very first Zen center established in the West and still in New York City to this day. Sokei-an Sasaki began practicing Zen in 1875 in Japan under Rinzai master Imekita Kosen. In his bio found at firstzen.org, Sokei-an's story reads as follows. Kosen's most celebrated disciple, Soyen Shaku, visited America in 1893 to attend the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago. In 1905, he returned to America where he lectured and taught briefly. Soyen assigned responsibility for the lay Zen Institute Kosen founded to his Dharma heir, Sokatsu Shaku. Sokei-an was Sokatsu's student and came to America with him in 1906 to establish a Zen community in this country. When Sokatsu returned to Japan in 1910, Sokei-an remained. After wandering across America and improving his English, he made several trips back to Japan and received credentials as a lay Zen master from Sokatsu. He became a priest during the 1930s because he felt Americans would not respect a layperson bringing Zen. Sokei-an Sasaki and Ruth Fuller Sasaki, who did get married, are owed a great debt of gratitude by Western Buddhists because of their pioneering work. The stories of Ruth and Sokei-an are told in depth in the new book Zen Odyssey, the story of Sokei-an, Ruth Fuller Sasaki, and the birth of Zen in America, by Janica Anderson and Stephen Zahavi Schwartz. Janica, the author, befriended Joan Watts some years ago, and the story of Ruth and Sokei-an captivated her. She researched and crafted the story over many years, and I'm pleased to have her on the show to discuss the book today. The book is amazing. It highlights their marriages, bringing Zen to the West, extensive stories about Ruth becoming the first Westerner ever ordained a Zen priest in Japan, and has a large list of well-known scholars like Alan Watts, Gary Snyder, and Burton Watson making appearances. If you are interested in Buddhism, this is essential history for you. Without further delay, I bring you my conversation with Janica Anderson, author of Zen Odyssey, out now from Wisdom Publications. Janica, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you.
So I'm curious if you can just go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and help us get to know you a little bit.
Okay. I got interested in this story because I had led groups at Esalen Institute, which included Alan Watts working there, and I had gotten to know Joan Watts, his daughter, and actually I'd gotten to know her quite a bit, and at one point I started a publishing company publishing the audio recordings of Esalen, which included Alan Watts. And I had the sound studio and the ability to transfer old reel-to-reel tapes to cassette. And Joan had in her attic 27 hours of interviews of Ruth, her grandmother, in 1966, at the year before her death. And the interviews were conducted by Gary Snyder. And she gave them to me partly because she wanted cassettes of them, and partly because she was very interested that somebody knows about her grandmother. And I was fascinated by the cassettes, by the interviews, and that's what started me in this journey.
Excellent. So just for some background information, who are Ruth Fuller Sasaki and Sokei-an Sasaki?
Well, Ruth was a wealthy woman in Chicago. She went to the University of Chicago. She was very, very smart. She studied Sanskrit at the University of Chicago. She studied a lot of Eastern religion materials. And she had an arranged marriage. Her parents arranged a marriage because she was very outspoken and wasn't very marriageable material at the time. And so they arranged a marriage to a man, a criminal attorney, a very prominent criminal attorney, 20 years her senior, who was crippled by polio. And he was a very nice man, but it wasn't a love marriage. And they had a daughter, and she continued studying Eastern religions, and she had a strong interest in all of this. And a lot of women in society were dabbling in this, but she didn't dabble. She was pretty serious. And at one point, she and her husband, they were very wealthy. She was wealthy independently of him. Her father had been in the commodities market in Chicago, and he was independently wealthy. His family was very wealthy, and he made a great deal of money himself. He actually prosecuted Al Capone's people. And at one point, they took more than one round-the-world cruise. And at one point, they went to Japan, and she met with Didi Suzuki, who had written the only books in English about Zen Buddhism. And she asked him, well, how can I learn more about Zen Buddhism? And he said, well, you can't in America because there's no teachers there, and the only way you can learn is to come to Japan. So she proceeded, when she got back to America, to make plans to go back to Japan. Now, her husband wasn't too keen on this because he depended upon her to make beautiful dinners for his clients and to raise his daughter. He wasn't happy about this, but she was going to do this. And so she went back to Japan, and Suzuki arranged for a teacher, which wasn't that easy to find a teacher who would teach a Westerner and a woman. And he arranged for a teacher who had a house that he was going to retire to, that she could come and meditate and learn with him. She had her own house, but she would come there every day and meditate. And one day she had an experience, and she actually had a satori experience. And when her translator realized what had happened and told the Roshi what had happened, the monks in the Zendo were very excited and invited her to sit with them. And no Westerner and no woman had ever been allowed to sit with the monks in the Zendo. It was an absolutely phenomenal experience for that to happen. And she was very, very excited, and she said in her writings that she felt that she had come home. It was just unbelievable for her for this to happen. And she spent the year there meditating and learning about Zen, and went home, and then went back another year, this time with her daughter. And this time her husband was very angry her husband, at that point, his health was declining. And when she went back, she spent another year. And when she went back to the States, she didn't know what to do because she didn't have a teacher. And somebody told her about Sokei-an, who was in New York at that point, starting to teach Zen in his apartment in New York. And he had been son of a samurai and had studied sculpture in the University of Tokyo from a very famous sculpting teacher. And he had been working at a post office and had a fellow employee talk to him about Zen. And he had went to study Zen and got very, very interested in it. A samurai was very high class, high caste in Japan. He's very highly educated, knew a great deal about many things, and his father had taught him many things. His father had died when he was 15, but his father had taught him many, many things. And so he already knew a great many things about a lot of things, and so he was very, very interested in Zen. And eventually, after he graduated, he was actually in the army for a while. When he finished that, his Zen teacher, took a bunch of them to America. And his Zen teacher asked him to marry one of the students that was a woman who couldn't come unless she was married. So he married the woman, the Japanese woman, to please his teacher so that she could go. And they actually bought a strawberry farm in Haywood, California. And they were going to raise strawberries, and then they were going to learn about America and maybe open a Zen place in America. But they were university students, and they were terrible farmers, and the place they bought actually was terrible land, and they were totally unsuccessful. And so all of them went back except Sokei-an and his wife. And they went to San Francisco, and he went to the Art Institute of San Francisco. But they found the yellow laws in San Francisco really oppressive, and so they went up to Seattle, and went out to the San Juan Islands where there were a lot of Indians and were much more comfortable there. And by then they had 2 children, and he made a contract with his wife that he would be there for the winter with her and the children, but all summer he would walk all over the Pacific Northwest and write stories for Japanese newspapers and journals about what he saw. And he would also meditate. And he did that until his mother became ill in Japan, and he sent his wife back to Japan to take care of his mother. And in the meantime, his teacher in Japan asked him to come back and continue his studies until the teacher felt he was a Zen master, and then asked him, when she went back to Japan, he went to New York and was in Greenwich Village and hung out with the Bohemians there and sculpted and worked for Tiffany's and worked on their sculptings there and was still writing and sending money back to his wife in Japan. And eventually his teacher in Japan said, you have to stop all this other activity and just start teaching. And his teacher wanted him to learn all about Americans and learn how to speak English really well so that he had a chance to really be able to teach Americans about Zen. And so he got other Japanese businessmen to help him open a Zen center in his apartment in New York. And he started doing that, and people told Ruth about this man in New York that was going to teach Zen. And she went to meet him and went back and forth and had dinner with him and got to know him. And they were both very strong-willed. And I guess Ruth talked about them having like 2 cats hissing at each other on a fence. And but they really appreciated each other. And so eventually Ruth's husband became really ill, and she put him in a nursing home near New York and moved to New York to work with Sokei-an and help him work his new Zen center. And they started the first Zen Center in the United States, 1930.
Okay.
And eventually, go ahead now.
So,
you keep going and going.
I know, right? And the story is just so spectacular. And you've woven this incredible tale about both of their lives, and you tell their early lives, and then you bring them together.
They were both incredibly big people, both incredibly bright, both incredibly expansive. I mean, they were unbelievable people, and both matched each other. You know, they both matched each other in their bigness. You know, they're both very, very smart people.
So your book tells this unbelievable story, and it also describes just how serious they both are in their practice. I mean, they have an incredibly serious Zazen sitting practice. They have an incredibly serious translating and artwork and founding the center. So it seems to me that these two are single-handedly responsible for the presence of Zen in the United States.
In the West.
Right.
Absolutely.
So what kind of what debt of gratitude does every American Buddhist owe to these two folks?
Well, I mean, back then, it was except for D.Z. Suzuki, who wrote about Zen in English, there was no knowledge about Zen Buddhism in America at all. And it wasn't until the 60s that there was any other practicing Roshi or any other Zen center in America. There was a long hiatus before there was any other thing happening in America. And they were the first people that brought Zen to America. And after Sokei-an died, he was interned during the war. And he died, he had bad health, and they eventually fell in love and married, and he died of bad health from being in the internment camps. And she went back to Japan and was ordained a Zen priest and had her own temple, which was absolutely unheard of, and was written up in Time magazine because it was such a phenomenal event. And she made a place where Westerners could come and learn about Zen. And people like Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith and Gary Snyder came there and learned about Zen and then brought it back, their knowledge of Zen, brought it back to Westerners and wrote about it. And so that, you know, she really was very instrumental in people understanding about what Zen was and knowing that Zen was there for them. So she had a tremendous influence on Zen being known about in the West.
So what drew you to Ruth and Sokei-an enough to want to tell this story? Because I know you worked on this book for years, and why did you feel powerful enough about the story of Ruth and Sokei-an to want to write this book?
First of all, I had a grandmother that was a lot like Ruth. My grandmother graduated from Wellesley in 1899. And for her generation, you know, she really stood out. And she was a very powerful lady, and I really loved her. And so she reminded me of my grandmother. And listening to those 27 hours of her interview with Gary Snyder just blew me away. And talking to Joan Watts, Joan Watts had an art studio next door to a friend of mine, and Joan Watts was the executor of Alan Watts' estate, and I had Alan Watts' lectures, and so I spent quite a lot of time with Joan. And Joan really realized that people didn't know how important her grandmother was to Zen. And I realized what an incredible opportunity this was to bring knowledge about her grandmother to people. And then as I listened to her, I mean, it was unbelievable to listen to her. And then I found out about Sokei-an, and that just fascinated me. And I realized they had fallen in love. And both of them had had arranged marriages. Both of them hadn't had love marriages, and they fell in love. And it just fascinated me. The whole story fascinated me. And I just could not leave it alone, even though I had a publishing house and a full life. I just couldn't leave it alone. I had to go forward and learn more about it. And I had Joan and Anne as part of the family to help me, go forward.
Mm-hmm. So The book, which I read and loved and think that everybody who hears this should buy, the book has this incredible tour of all of the sites in their lives. So you talk about the house in Chicago. You talk about the brownstones, both of them in New York City. You talk about Sokei-an's apartments. You talk about Ruth's temple, Ryosen-an, in Japan.
Yes.
Did you get to go to the sites in the book firsthand? Like, did you go to Ruth's houses and Sokei-an's house and Ruth's townhouse and the first Zen Institute and the Japanese temples? Like, did you go on any pilgrimages to these sites?
Well, I didn't get to Japan because I tried to raise money with a Kickstarter, and I wasn't able to do it, and I didn't have the money. But I went every place else. I went to Ruth's, the house she grew up in Hinsdale. I went to the house she and her first husband built, Swan House, a beautiful home that they built in Hinsdale. I went to the brownstone. The brownstone she had bought for the Zen Institute in New York happened to be for sale, so I was able to go and walk into it and walk all around it in New York. I went to the first Zen Institute of New York was in a different place, but I was able to go to where it was now because it still is there and still functioning. I went to the home of Carlton Gamer, who was her daughter, who married Alan Watts. Her second husband was Carlton Gamer, and I went to his home in Colorado Springs. And so I went to many places that were homes of people. I went to the home of her secretary. While she was living in Japan, she had a secretary in the States who could take care of things in the States for her because she constantly needed help from somebody in the States to buy things for her. Like she constantly would buy furnishings and things for the first Zen Institute in New York. She would buy furnishings for them and all kinds of things for them. And so she had a Japanese woman in New York that could buy things for her. And so I went to see her, So, I went to all these people and all these places to interview people and visit the places where she had been and where she had lived, and it was fascinating. I loved all that.
Were the people that were living in her homes, like in Chicago, were they amazed when you just showed up at their house and told them the story of how their home is linked to the founding of American Buddhism?
They knew about her, and I've sent them the book. She built this beautiful home called Swan House, and they knew about her. They didn't know the details of the story, but they knew about her, and they were very gracious in letting me wander around the house, and they gave me plans of the house. I had the architectural plans in the book.
Yeah.
Because it's such a beautiful home. And she helped design that house. She was instrumental in designing the house, and it was called Swan House, and there was swans carved on the eaves of the house. And she, one of her trips to China, she lived in the home of an embassy, a beautiful home where there was a center courtyard with buildings all around the center, and they stayed there. And she had merchants coming by cart and by camel and by horseback, bringing goods for her to look at, antiques and all kinds of rugs and silks and everything. And she went home with 50 crates of Chinese antiques, and they would fill that house. And that house was filled with these things she bought in China. And I had descriptions of rooms that she had filled with these beautiful things. And when I went to Joan Watts's house in Montana, she had a couch bed that came from that house that Sokei-an actually slept in the brownstone. A beautiful, beautiful couch bed. But because she had so much money, she could just buy anything she wanted. Just gorgeous. And I imagine, I wanted to make a film, and can you imagine the scene in this film where daily these merchants would by camel, by cart, by horseback, would bringing all these beautiful things for her to look at, to buy. I mean, what a scene,
My goodness.
A beautiful scene. But anyway, so
have you
yeah.
ever? Did you get a chance to? So Sokei-an was basically like a master sculptor, and
He was a sculptor. Yes,
did you get to
he
see
had,
any of his work?
yes, at the Institute in New York has pieces of his sculpting, and I photographed a few pieces, and they're in the book. And he had studied in the University of Tokyo. He had studied with a very famous sculptor, and even before that, before he had gone to the University of Tokyo, he had apprenticed to a sculptor, and before he went to the university, he had walked all around the Japanese Alps and sculpted dragons for temples. And that's how he had made his way, and how he fed himself, and was able to live. And so he had, even before he went to the University of Tokyo, he had been sculpting. But he also, he wrote. He also wrote. So he wrote poetry too. I mean, he was many faceted person.
Do you have any surviving correspondence between Sokei-an and Ruth in their own handwriting?
No, I'm not aware that they ever wrote to each other, because she would just go to, before she lived in New York, she would just go to New York. So I'm not aware that they wrote to each other.
Was there anything?
So they may have. I'm just not aware of it.
Do the Watts family or anybody that you've worked with on this project, do they have any journals or writings or anything like that she ever sent to them or wrote?
Well, all the time that she was in Japan, the first Zen Institute of New York had a thing called Zen Notes, which was a newsletter that they had an enormous audience for, that they sent out everywhere. I mean, because they were the first place that anybody knew anything about Zen from. And they had an enormous mailing list for this. And all the years she was in Japan, she wrote letters to this Zen Notes about what was happening for her in Japan. And I had all of those. And so her life in Japan, and her words, I had to use for the book.
Gotcha.
And that was wonderful. I mean, it was a wonderful thing to have, So I had that, and there was also a thing called Cat's Yawn, which was an earlier version of newsletter that the Institute had, that I had use of. But I also had letters. She had a best friend, and I found her letters in a library at Yale that I found, personal letters that she wrote to her best friend. And, so I had other letters that I found, and, she had very prolific letter writer, and I found other letters that she wrote. And, but, there was just so much that I found about her and of her, and,
yeah.
I have any trouble finding material.
So a name, I just want to go on a small tangent here for a second. One of the names that you keep mentioning is Alan Watts, and the reason that you and I were able to correspond and now do this conversation is because of Joan and Ann Watts, who I had on this show last month to talk about their collected letters of Alan Watts book. And they mentioned that you had written this book, and they suggested we get together. And in that book, they both mentioned that Ruth and Alan have sort of an interesting relationship, because Ruth thinks that Alan isn't serious enough, but Alan is also one of the public faces of Eastern philosophy in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. So are people surprised when you tell them that Alan Watts quit formal Zen practice after his first attempted koan with Sokei-an?
Well, first of all, we make sure we establish the relationship. Ruth's daughter, Eleanor, they went to London because Ruth had been a concert pianist. Ruth also knew 4 languages, but she was very highly educated, and she was a concert pianist, and her teacher had moved from Chicago to London, and Ruth took her to study with her teacher in London. And she took her to the Buddhist Society in London, where Alan Watts was a secretary. Well, actually, his father was a secretary. And Alan Watts was a prodigy. I mean, he wrote his first book at a very young age, as a teenager, practically. And Alan Watts was there, and her daughter, Eleanor, met Alan there, and they fell in love and married and came to the United States. So Ruth was the mother-in-law of Alan Watts. And so Alan Watts came because the war was imminent, and he wanted to remove himself from London and the war. He came to live in New York in an apartment very near Ruth and Sokei-an. And Alan talks about in one of his books about he watched Ruth and Sokei-an fall in love. And they did a lot of things together. They did driving trips and went to dinner together and things. And Alan had already communicated with Sokei-an very young. He knew about Sokei-an, and he had written letters to Sokei-an very young. And he really admired who Sokei-an was, and admired the fact that he was a really incredible teacher. But it wasn't Alan's forte to have a teacher like Sokei-an, even though he really liked Zen and really liked the idea of it. It wasn't his thing to sit and figure out koans and do the whole trip. He didn't last very long. Sokei-an didn't have much patience with him, and so it didn't last very long. And Alan never really got to that place with all the different religions and things he studied. I mean, if you look at Joseph Campbell, he never did either. You know, he studied. They both were people that introduced everybody to everything, and Alan introduced everybody to everything. I remember the first book I read of him, he blew me away, I mean, he just, took my mind and blew it apart, and I was so grateful to him, but Alan didn't practice. He didn't get into a practice with something, but he totally admired Sokei-an, and I think he wished he had been able to do that, but he didn't. It wasn't who he was.
That's it's a really good little story in the book about Alan and Sokei-an doing their koan practice.
Yeah, yeah. Alan just couldn't put it together.
I love it. So Sokei-an was a Japanese man who lived in the United States for decades, and he was a really peaceful man, yet we know the terrible and horrific history of Japanese internment in the United States during World War II after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And so he gets arrested by the FBI when he's founding the first Zen Institute in America, and it's a turning point in his life, and it kind of led him into like a downturn in his own physical abilities as a Roshi and as a human being. So how did his internment affect the first Zen Institute, which was just sort of getting off the ground?
Well, Ruth had bought this brownstone. The institute had been in his apartment, which had been supported by a couple of Japanese businessmen. They had helped furnish the apartment and everything, and then Ruth's money came into it, and then Ruth bought this brownstone, which I have a picture of in the book. And she put an elevator in it, which was unheard of at that point. And she originally had an apartment on the top floor for her mother, but her mother died before she had a chance to use it. But she had apartment floor for Sokei-an, an apartment for her, and then 2 floors for the Zen Institute and a library. And it opened to the Institute a month ahead of time, and then it was having a public opening. And I think it was either the day before or the day after Pearl Harbor that it opened. I can't remember which was which. But of course, then it couldn't open. Then it was gone, because here at Japanese Institute opening with Pearl Harbor. And for a whole year, the FBI followed them around. And, they looked at his writings, because he'd written all this stuff for Japanese journals, and they looked at his writings, and they picked out something and said, well, this doesn't look right, But, I live in San Francisco. I've lived out here for years. And, they rounded up whole blocks of people here, It didn't matter who they were or what they did. They just rounded them up and had them take anything they could carry, and put them on buses and took them into the deserts, horrible places. And at least Sokei-an didn't go to a horrible place like they did here. There were terrible places they brought them to here. He was in Maryland. It wasn't quite as bad. But unfortunately, Sokei-an had high blood pressure. His father had died of it. And he had just had a hemorrhoid operation before he was taken. And so he wasn't well. And so it was very bad for him, because he didn't have good health care there. And he probably would have lived a long life with a high blood pressure. They didn't have the kind of care they do nowadays. But he didn't do well, and it broke his health, which was very sad, because it shortened his life. And very sad.
So he did have children when he was alive with his first wife.
Yes.
Were you able? Does he have any surviving family? Were you able to contact any of the Sokei-an Sasaki family?
But I had letters. Ruth kept in touch with his children and their children, and I have letters in the book that she communicated with them, and she kept in touch with them, and helped them. And I'm sure they're still alive, and I'm sure the family is still there. And some of them went back to Japan, but he was helpful to his family and his children. And but I didn't have any direct communication with them.
I know that you and Joan Watts are particularly close friends. What was it like spending time with the Watts family when preparing this book? Was it like a really joyful project for them to be able to help you out with this?
With Joan, yeah, and also with Carlton. Eleanor's second husband after she divorced with Alan. It was very good with Carlton because Eleanor confided, or Ruth confided with Eleanor about her love of Sokei-an. And, the Zen Institute wasn't that happy having people know about Sokei-an and Ruth being in love. That was something they were a little nervous about, to say the least. And so it was really, Alan wrote about it in his book, but that was, of course, later. But Carlton knew a lot about it. By that point, Eleanor was dead, Alan's wife. But Ruth had confided in her daughter, Eleanor, and then so Carlton knew a lot about Ruth and Sokei-an, and so he was able to, really tell me a lot about their relationship, and that was really wonderful because for both Sokei-an and Ruth, it was the love of their lives. And Ruth hadn't really had much of a sexual relationship with her husband, and Sokei-an really gave her that in her life that she hadn't had. Mm-hmm. And and they had a wonderful love relationship, and it was wonderful that Carlton could tell me about that. I really appreciated that.
So when you went to the first Zen Institute of America in New York City, are there still pieces of furniture or paintings in the building that Ruth is responsible for putting in the Institute?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, yes. She bought a lot of things for that Institute, and they're still there. And like I said, the Sokei-an's sculpting there. They have they had huge archives of Sokei-an stuff. The woman, Mary Falcus, who was the strong woman in that institute, was very jealous of Ruth. Ruth had all this money, and a lot of people get very jealous of people that have a lot of money. And also Ruth had a love relationship with Sokei-an, and a lot of people have a lot of trouble with somebody who has a relationship with the guru that they can't have. And so Mary was very jealous of that, and after Ruth had passed, Mary lived for a very, very long time, and Mary was very big part of that institute long after Ruth had died. And Mary was responsible for having a book published of Sokei-an's lectures. There were a bunch of women who sat taking notes of Sokei-an's lectures, and they published a book about it, and of his lectures, so that a lot of his teachings are available now. And so there was jealousy. So if you look at their website, there isn't a lot of Ruth there, even though
Right.
Ruth was a strong part of their institute. And Ruth, when she translated all these, she had a library and all these scholars, and she translated all these books. And the Institute in New York published a lot of those books. But you still don't have a sense of her strong presence as part of that institute, even though she was very much a part of its beginnings. And that's partly because of the jealousy of Mary. And they're honoring Mary.
Right. So your book is really in depth, and I love it for that. And it also reads very smoothly. It's not a slog of a read. It's really fantastic in how readable it is. But I'm curious.
And that's partly Stephen. Stephen had worked for me. I did all the research, and then I did a first draft. But I love books. I do a tremendous amount of reading, and I know what good writing is. And Stephen had worked for me when I had my tape publishing company. And I knew what a wonderful writer he was and a good editor he was. And so I knew I needed somebody to help me with that. And part of what you see is Stephen's good writing. So he took all of my research and my first draft and made it better.
Excellent.
So what you see, a lot of the good writing is Stephen's. And I'm very grateful for that.
It's really cool that you and he are co-authors on here as well. I think that's
right.
great.
And we were friends. We were good friends, so it was very comfortable for me to work with him, which I was very grateful for.
Yeah. So this book is such an in-depth look, but were there any questions that you couldn't find out the answer to with regards to Ruth and Sokei-an? Were there any questions left unanswered?
Not that I'm aware of, actually.
That's got to feel good.
Yeah. I mean, actually, Michael, who's the president of the Institute in New York, was very, very generous. He totally opened his files to me. I could copy anything I wanted. He was very generous with his time, even though there was that little thing with Mary, some little old jealousy there and stuff. I never felt any reluctance for them to not help me. And he did, I think on the back of the book it does say, Michael felt the book was very accurate. And I didn't know when I sent him, he asked for a copy of the book before I published it, not to necessarily change anything, but because he just wanted to see it. And he wrote back and felt it was very accurate. And I did a quick sigh.
Yeah.
I didn't know what he'd say, and I felt very grateful that he felt that, because we certainly tried to make it very accurate. But I really had a great deal of help, and I don't know if there was anything that I wanted to know I didn't find out. I did feel bad I didn't get to Japan. And the other book, a small book that was written by a librarian, using also the interviews of Gary Snyder. She went to Japan, and so I read what she had written about Japan, and I knew a great deal about Japan. And at that point, school children went by busloads to her place, because she was very well known about in Japan, even though she wasn't known about here. So, and recently I found, up until recently, there was always a Roshi at the temple there. But recently, at the moment, I understand there isn't a Roshi there. And
Gotcha.
that's just because the Roshi that was there got ill or something. But,
do you have any more projects that you're planning on in the future? Or is this kind of like a nice little rest time after several years of hard work?
Well, I might write a biographical thing that I have an ancestry of witches hung in Salem.
Oh, wow.
And my grandfather talked to me that I had 3 of my ancestors were accused of witchcraft, and their mother was accused of witchcraft earlier, and 2 of them were hung. And there was a PBS series done about them, and Arthur Miller wrote about one of them, Rebecca North. And when I was growing up, I visited, the family still owned her house, and I visited their house when I was young, and I have visited recently, and it really influenced my life, knowing about her. And I lived in the Amazon for a while, and I lived with a shaman, ayahuasquero curandero, and I traveled with him in the Amazon, and we met a man that he had known, and he was the son of an ayahuasquero, and this woman had written a book about his father, and he had ended up marrying her, and she was a professor at a college in Southern California. And he invited me to come to dinner at their house in Southern California when I came back to the States. So I went down, and she said, you know, I'm very lucky because most of the witches in Europe that were burned at the stake were burned before they ever had children. So the genetic pools died with them. But my ancestry, they were in their 80s when they were hung, so their genetic pool lived. So there's something about hereditary witch in my family. So I'm quite fascinated by it, and all my life it has influenced my life, and I've kind of like to write about it. So, you know, when I worked at Harvard, because I was a researcher, I had what was called an open stack pass, which meant I could go anywhere. And Harvard had a huge occult library, and I spent a lot of time there, you know, so things like that. And so it's just always interested me, and I thought I might write about it.
Well, you definitely have your work cut out for that project. But Janica, thank you so much for talking to me today. Your book, Zen Odyssey, the story of Sokei-an, Ruth Fuller, Sasaki, and the birth of Zen in America, is out now from Wisdom Publications. Janica, thank you so much for spending this hour with me today.
Thank you very much. I really have enjoyed this. Thank you.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soda. Music on Classical Ideas is performed and composed by Derek Strybing. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you would like to support this show, please subscribe or leaving a rating in iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.